So I had spent 14 and a half years in 2 different groups.
Yeah.
And so it was quite a bit of unsorting to do. And, the ex-members, the biggest help for me was attending conferences and sitting with ex-members. It took me a full maybe year and a half, 2 years before I was willing to go to any kind of therapeutic environment, working with a therapist, a mainstream therapist.
No.
And so the resistance came largely because both the TM movement and Divine Love had both discouraged any involvement with a psychologist or psychiatrist or any kind of mainstream therapist. So as a result, my prejudices had been well established, and breaking through that, it was like levels of ice, the thin ice that I had to break through the next layer and then another layer as I was coming out, feeling the various and sundry influences of 2 groups' experiences.
I mean, there's so much in parallel that people who are leaving Scientology, when I left in 1983, and very rapidly started to see that you have layers of the onion, that you have to go through these things.
So true.
What you were saying before about, the promise of supernatural powers, of course, in Scientology, that's a primary goal. And I think the thing that perhaps most surprised me a few months after leaving, I read about the definition. I mean, you said about the phobia being built up about therapists and psychologists and anybody who might know anything about the mind and be able to warn you in any way. But I read a definition of the word depersonalization as used by psychiatrists. Now, in Scientology, your goal is to be able to astral travel, as they would say in other movements, to be able to leave your body. And here I was reading about a psychiatric disorder that meant that you didn't feel you were in your body. Now, Scientologists talk about being exterior with full perception, but I never, well, I can think of one person I met who had a supposed out of the body experience, but that was actually before Scientology. Other people would say that they kind of felt they were just outside their body, but they were still perceiving through their body. And this was so much the definition of this condition. And then found out about derealization, where the world around you seems to melt, and you can have these states where you talked about, the guru suddenly is surrounded by a golden light or something of this case. You also talked about the way the experience diminishes, that towards the beginning you have these quite powerful experiences, almost of awe, of euphoria, of feeling high. And it makes you feel certain. It makes you feel there's something really right about what you're doing because it feels good. And I think probably anybody out there who's taken cocaine will understand feeling good is not necessarily, a gateway.
Beneficial.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, John, you raised some really valid points. That the idea of exteriorization, is that what they call it in Scientology?
Yeah.
That would be being called the witness. So witnessing your activity and being outside of yourself while you're doing any action was considered a higher state of consciousness. Yeah. So what we had to cope with is that altered states of consciousness are not necessarily higher states of consciousness. So, it's that evaluation, it's that qualitative value that we placed upon the so-called mystical state. And gurus and, in my experience, both groups encourage these states as the preferred value. So for individuals that were experiencing depersonalization, they couldn't cope with the world at large many times. And so what did they do with that? They invested themselves more deeply into the path, thinking that more of that altered state would increase their ability to deal with the world. And I saw people then become decompensated, not able to cope with the real world, and get driven off their own talents. They couldn't realize their own goals because they couldn't focus enough to realize them.
One of the strangest examples I saw of it quite early on in Scientology, I met a guy and he was covered in bandages, and he had walked through a glass door and the
Wow.
been cut, and he
Yeah.
was grinning. He was smiling because he said, "I was exterior." So that thing of how you handle reality and your capacity to deal with reality, if you're going to be cutting yourself to ribbons to be in this state. And I think we do see a lot of that in people who believe they've achieved. I mean, back in 1991, I was asked by Collins, now HarperCollins, to write a book about transcendental meditation. And that's when I met Pat, in fact, and interviewed him. And I decided not to write the book because I was already in enough trouble being attacked by Scientology. And I discovered that transcendental meditation, was similarly aggressive towards anybody that criticized it. It was not this lovey-dovey peace and love group at all.
No.
It was quite vicious.
Yeah.
And I was hearing about people who were, I interviewed a woman in LA who had fractured her coccyx doing the levitational hopping, and will be damaged for life. There's nothing you can do about it. You can't glue it back together again.
No, you can't. Yeah.
And it's very painful.
Yeah.
There'll be experiences of terrible pain. But it interested me, again, we're talking about parallels, that we're sold the same dreams of world peace and we see in the leaders that they are not ideal human beings. When I found out about Ron Hubbard giving what are called severe reality adjustments, something I had never heard of. In 8 years in Scientology, nobody had ever mentioned this to me. And then a friend of mine who'd worked with Hubbard did it to my wife. And that a severe reality adjustment, you stand this far away from somebody, you scream at them, and basically accuse them all of all the horrors in the world. You traumatize them as much as possible.
So that's Miscavige's action. He does that every day.
He's very good at it. Well, Hubbard seemed to do it quite a lot as well. When I asked this guy, where on earth did you learn this awful technique? He said, head in hands, he started crying. He said, well, Ron Hubbard does it to people all the time. And for me, that moved things away, that I kind of went, I don't want to follow somebody who can't even control their own temper. That to me is a very low state of being.
Yeah, you bring up a valid point. I remember when the Swami asked us all to edit a book he had just written, and he really handed it out to everyone, and we all, made corrections and handed them over to him. He had a hissy fit. He went mad. He started screaming at us, "How dare you correct my words? I meant to have bad English in this sentence."
Yeah.
It was Indian English, without sounding too,
Yeah, I mean, there is a way that people speak in different parts of the world. There's an American English, there's a British English, and there is an Indian English.
Right.
And
yet his effort, he wanted us, he at least promoted that he wanted to hear from us. But in reality, he just wanted us to rubber stamp it, or he wanted to use it as an opportunity for him to display total control and power over all of us, which was quite effective. We all went whimpering into our corners and kind of skittered away. And it was one of those moments that stuck in my head when I decided to leave. It was just that kind of thing that reinforced my opinion that this wasn't all I had hoped it would be.
No.
But it was a whole mountain that I had to overcome when I left group number 2, because I thought, should I go back to group number 1? But I'd already burnt those bridges. I'd litigated against them. So there was no hope of going back there. And thank you, whoever, the great beyond, whatever it is, that I didn't go back to any of it. And my good fortune was that I met people like yourself in the network who helped, guide me really through that recovery period, when you really are trying to put the pieces of your experiences together and relate them to the world at large, the real world, if you will, that we encounter every day, and still maintain some semblance of health and mental health and physical health.
I mean, my a profound concern. I was sort of steamrolled by Scientology. I spent a dozen years pretty much being a lone voice. And so the harassment machinery was
Oh my
aimed at
God.
me.
I can't imagine what you must have gone through. I've heard stories and that they make your toes curl. Confronting that.
But
Fortunately, there are so many more critics these days.
oh yeah,
Um,
I left the scene in January '96 to
yeah,
kind of lick my wounds, and it took me a
yeah,
lot longer to do that. I was very fortunate in that although I was involved with Scientology for 9 years, I was on the periphery. I was never a live-in member, and I was never humiliated or abused. I gave them money, they messed my head up. I did the upper levels, the OT levels through 5. I did training courses and all that, but I lived out in the world. And so my recovery was so much different because I still had all of my social contact with the outside world. I was in a good situation with my family. And then I started to get the harassment from Scientology. In fact, I immediately, from the first
really.
day. And the trauma of the cult for me was after leaving. I had 12 years of doing that, writing a book, talking to about 500 former members and trying to do what I could to help them. And of course, trying to understand what it was and how it worked. Then I went away for, basic from 96 to 2012.
So you wrote a piece of Blue Sky. When I read it, that was it seemed like a long time ago now.
It was a long time ago. It's 30
Yeah,
years ago. I published
yeah.
it in 1990. The unexpurgated version, which is called Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, is now available. I had to paraphrase 60 Hubbard passages because of this bizarre ruling in various American court cases that you couldn't quote from private letters and documents. So they're all back there, and I added another 20 or 30 in the mix to, these astonishing things that Hubbard said, about selling the religion angle to people.
Right.
That his only goal was to smash his name into history, which he said in a letter in 1938. And that when he discovered the Dianetic technique, there's a letter in 1949 to his literary agent, Forry Ackerman, where he says he's discovered a technique which has more selling angles than anything he's ever heard of. And using this technique can rape women, and the next day they won't even know what happened. He doesn't say anything about benefiting or helping people.
What are your goals?
Yeah. So, but anyway, I came back because it became evident to me that many people who are leaving Scientology, and I'm sure this is true for other groups too, and there are thousands of other groups out there, don't fully recover. Some of them will go to a therapist and try and get help that way. Most therapists don't have a clue what to do because they'll try and talk about your childhood experience or your cognitive behavioral approaches or what have you, without understanding that the layers of the onion have to be penetrated first. You have to get the cultic shell out of the way. And I had a particular conversation with a woman who'd been involved from, she was 2 years old when her mum and dad got in. She went through horrible abuse. She's been on television about it, so there's no confidence here. But she then had 5 years in the inner Sea organization, which ex-members still speak of as the elite of Scientology. It's actually the slave group of Scientology. And she came to me, 15 or 16 years later, never having really digested this. She has a degree in medical science, so she's very smart.
Quite bright. Yeah.
She said to me in one of our first conversations, is it true that reality is an agreement, which is one of Hubbard's dicta? And I said, yes, if you're the hypnotist, reality is an agreement. But otherwise, for the rest of us, no. And the next week, when we spoke, she said that she'd used scented fabric conditioner in her laundry. And we both knew what she meant, which is that when you're trained in the Sea organization, you do a thing called the hygiene hat or training, where you find out that Ron Hubbard was absolutely paranoid about scents, as was Rajneesh, I note, maybe some of the others too. Mm-hmm. And so nobody was allowed to use scented soap, scented shampoo, or anything. And the significant point was we hadn't talked about this. So she had, for the first time, been able to question one of these, biblical rules that are handed
Right.
down. And I came back and I started talking again because I realized there would be people who had left 20 years before and they just decided they could walk away, that it would be all right to not think about it ever again.
Right.
Yet when I talked to them, all of their beliefs were just reworded forms of Scientology. They
Yeah,
still
they hadn't
believed
left
the techniques were good. They,
the
they
concept.
didn't
I got
realize
something good out of it. Yeah.
yeah, they didn't realize that they'd actually entered a kind of lobster pot. They'd gone
That's
into
right.
a belief system, and that from the first moment that you're approached, you're actually being tricked, and you're being given an experience. And along the years, 5 years ago, I met Yuval Laor, and we started
Oh yeah.
getting
Well,
his astonishing work on how the feelings of certainty develop in people. That William James talked about this long
that's
ago,
right.
and that we come to be convinced of ideas and we can't see beyond them. We can't get beyond them. So, that you stimulated that thought in me.
Yeah, I think it's so important for people to understand that the walking away is just the first step, that there are effects that live far beyond your group experience. And really, again, it's up to the individual to find their own way. But I would encourage people to take a look at some of that experience with someone who understands group dynamics and cultic involvement.
Yeah, and I mean, there are many. I mean, Take Back Your Life by Yang.
Oh, it's fantastic. Yeah, I love that book.
And if
Every client, either gets it or I encourage them to get it. I either give it to them or encourage them to get it.
and also a more recent cooperation, Escaping Utopia, for people who have been born into groups.
That's so important. That's the group who's coming out, born and raised, which is, for me being a first generation, member, the shocking and difficult experiences of the second generation and multi-generation ex-members are unique and even more difficult. The trauma is more profound, even though people who've been involved in groups can have been traumatized. That may be the reality, but for people born and raised, it's certainly almost always the case.
I think the other thing is, there are tens now of accounts of autobiographies of ex-Scientologists, some of which are extremely good. I mean, I recommend Blown for Good by Mark Headley particularly, but there are lots. Counterfeit Dreams by Jeff Hawkins is good. Some of the early ones in the 50s, the woman who ran Scientology, Helen O'Brien, wrote a book called Dianetics in Limbo, which is it made me cry. It's so poignant, her direct experience of Hubbard. These are all useful, but it concerns me that you also have to understand the intention of the guru, the intention of the leader, and that often that's quite missed, that even in these accounts, you'll find these people talking, for example, saying that Hubbard was a compassionate man. I've heard that a few times. And you go, well, this is mystical manipulation that you're seeing. This is him actually behaving in a way that you will see to be compassionate. When he talked with a filmmaker called Charlie Nairn in 1968 off camera, and Nairn made a beautiful documentary called The Shrinking World of L. Ron Hubbard, which is the only hostile interview, and Hubbard falls all over himself. He talks about having a first wife and a third wife. I had no second wife, he says. So he talks about two marriages, but says I had no second wife. He's asked about his Swiss bank accounts, and he says there are no Swiss. I do have one Swiss bank account. Then he's asked about reincarnation and whether he believes in it, and he fumbles. He's not sure what to say. And Charlie says, "But your followers believe," and he says, "Oh yes." But Charlie said that before he interviewed him, he said to Hubbard, "This is all a scam, isn't it?" And Hubbard said, "Yes," quite openly, And he said, "It must be awful for you having to keep that hidden all the time." And Hubbard, narcissistically said, "Yes, poor me, having to con all these people and not admit to it." And then Charlie said, why do you do it? And Hubbard said, it's really nice being able to give your wife, tell your wife, we made $10,000 today. And this is 1968. This is hundreds of thousands of dollars now. But the main reason is I like to catch the clever ones and reel them in. So the first thing is you have to understand the life of the guru. In researching TM, I found out that the man who calls himself Maharishi and is called Maharishi, great teacher by the world, and I refuse to call him that because he's not a great teacher. He's Mahesh. It's like I don't talk about LRH or, I'll talk about Ron Hubbard, not the way he wanted me to say it, but the way I want to say it. But I discovered that he was a liar, that I found two stories told by Mahesh about how he developed the technique. In one, he said he was in the Himalaya after the Shankaracharya he was studying with had died. And in the other, he said he was in South India and he was worshipping at a shrine of Lakshmi, the deity of wealth, which I thought was rather appropriate. And the technique came to him. Finding out that the frailties, the bad behavior, you'll often find fraud. Ron Hubbard was convicted for check fraud before Scientology. Joseph Smith, founder of the Mormons, was convicted of fraud before he started the movement. Finding out the biography, I think, is important, and then finding out the history of the movement and what actually happened. And a lot of people think they can just swap stories about the abuses and being a victim and how you survive. Finally, and for me, the most important thing is looking at what you still believe. And that's sacred. If you still believe this stuff, that's up to you. But examining the dogma and saying, do I believe that's true still? Because you don't get it out of your behavior until you look at what the belief is, I feel.
And how you've gotten there, and what parts of the belief system you still embrace. It becomes important, and I think it holds people back from really being free of the influences of a destructive group.
Yes. And I think it's something we all need to reconsider every now and then, because our my side bias, our confirmation bias, our way of avoiding cognitive dissonance by saying, well, I must be right, gets in the way of looking at evidence. And so again, taking on a more scientific view of information, and which of course means being willing to change your mind, being able to say, oh, the evidence actually adds up to something different than what I thought it did before.
Yeah, I think that even in the field of looking at cultic abuse or undue influence or coercive persuasion, even how to label it becomes an issue of controversy, and we can't agree on that. Yet the experience, as you're saying, it's important to have various definitions that different types of people can relate to.
Yes.
And so some people will jump onto coercive persuasion, but stay away from the cult word. Yet the information's still all there. They can get some framework, some model that explains their reality and is helpful to them. And I think that's of great benefit, depending on where you're coming from. I know a lot of people are like, I wasn't in a cult, yet undue influence might be something they can settle on.
Yeah. I mean, I tend to go with Margaret Singer's term exploitative persuasion because it's self-explanatory. I've sat in on so many discussions where people want to argue that the word brainwashing is useful. I mean, Benjamin Zablocki,
Sure.
Alex Stein,
Sure.
hold that word. I think there becomes a danger in a word when it becomes loaded language.
That's right.
I don't tend to use the word hypnosis because everybody knows what hypnosis is, but yet when I talk about it, they don't. Yeah. So I will talk about guided imagination, which most people can,
relate to.
Accept. And it's
I can imagine something, and as I'm brought along, even watching a television program, you can be guided through that imagination.
Yeah,
so I think that's more relatable.
And with the word cults, I'm very reluctant to let go of it because it isn't a pejorative word. It only became a negative word. This one I've gone into. The first mention of it in a pejorative way is in the American Heritage Dictionary in the 1890s, much earlier than I'd thought. But the Oxford Dictionary up until 1977 didn't accept any negative definition. And that is the go-to place for the meaning of words because they do the big work. But their definition is simply a group that forms around an idea or a leader, that is devoted to an idea or a leader, which to me isn't necessarily a bad thing, you know.
No, but it's hard for me to imagine that people have been taken in by the con of TM, that it's some kind of special meditation technique and not just the relaxation responses presented by Herbert Benson from Harvard. That there is some kind of cult that they've joined. They could maybe relate to being taken in by a false doctrine, but they can't relate to them having joined a cult. So we're talking about, that majority of members who approach the mass movements, whereas, the smaller groups, one-on-ones, or even 12 members, which we all know exist and are probably more prevalent than the bigger groups, they can relate to that word cult because it was very much that, with the focus on that leader.
Yeah, I mean, I default now to authoritarianism. That's my concern, because that defines the relationship of either somebody who is a bully and thinks they should be in charge, they're an authoritarian, or somebody who believes that somebody else should tell them what to believe and how to behave, they're an authoritarian.
The Q source.
Yeah,
right now, maddening.
Yeah,
but not surprising. I mean, people are shocked by it because there isn't a visible leader. It doesn't require that.
No, and
you said cult ideology. It's something that can be abstract and not focused on an individual.
And an authoritarian ideology, which is to say something that you're not allowed to test. You get your little Q drops, and you're supposed to believe them as if the person emanating this information was a source of perfect truth. And when you don't know who the person is and you can't test what they're saying, then you're in trouble. Whoever that person is, it's an authoritarian relationship. And so, I mean, I moved away and I wrote a book called Opening Minds, which we're just about to reissue as Opening Our Minds, because we made some changes to it, which is to look at the problem of authoritarianism throughout society and show
I think that's an important thought. I mean, important to address, because I think that encompasses both the political sphere and the religious and organizational spheres in businesses who use various techniques in order to maintain a coherent business environment. They call it a coherent.
I mean, the perversity is that I started studying public relations as an influence technique first when I was 19, because I had just got involved with Scientology, and Hubbard had just issued this thing called the Marketing Series, and somebody gave it to me to read, and he recommended positioning as a method. And he said that he'd read this book, Positioning the Battlefield Mind by Rees and Trout, and it was a good book. And so I went and got it and I read it. And the first thing I realized was that Hubbard hadn't understood it, that what he described as positioning was not what Rees and Trout described as positioning.
Interesting.
But that began my interest in public relations and advertising as a way of manipulating people. So I was reading those kind of texts through Scientology. Towards the end of my involvement in Scientology, my wife took the registrar sales course, and I was profoundly shocked when I saw the Big League Sales by Les Dane, the book that was being used, and the notions about hard selling, about driving somebody to borrow money that they couldn't afford to repay, and basically ruin themselves with the promise that by doing Scientology, they'd be able to earn huge amounts of money. And of course, since then, I've met hundreds of people who were driven to bankruptcy or the edge of bankruptcy by their membership. In fact, I know one guy who will be working 2 jobs for the rest of his life, and he's in his 30s, to pay back money he donated towards a building so that he would get a free car parking space.
Wow. Yeah.
So the horrors of this. So when I left Scientology and started to look at, I mean, it was Conway and Siegelman. The article Information Disease is what started. And I then read Snapping and sort of went, but that didn't happen to me. And I don't know anybody it did happen to.
Right.
So that set up a perplexity, so that, later on, reading Sargent's Battle for the Mind and his 2 other books, Steve Hassan's Combating Cult Mind Control, Lifton's Thought Reform, and Margaret's book when it finally came out, which was late in that process for me.
Yeah.
All of these things come together, and as Margaret found in the 60s, she talked about battered wives presenting in a very similar way to prisoners of war who'd been put through thought reform processes, and that you were seeing the same PTSD, the same symptoms. And for me, I spread that in the 90s when I left the Scientology arena, the cult arena. I began to study terrorism seriously and go, well, it's the same thing. You're dealing with a fanatical belief that will lead you, in fact, to be willing to dispense of your own existence or
existence, literally, not figuratively. It's an important issue, and education and the powers that be seem not so motivated to educate on this issue. And I don't mean to sound conspiratorial like my cohorts on the other side of the political equation. But I find it, why not have it as part of the educational curriculum in, middle school throughout the world?
Well, I think that my friend Ira Chalef, who I've known now for 43 years, I worked this out the other day, we're good friends. He's written about courageous followership, how to challenge a leader who's going wrong, rather than just presuming that leaders are all narcissists, but how to challenge them. But also intelligent disobedience. And that little book is just wonderful. He has a video, which if you look up Blink, Think, Choice, Voice, it gets you this video, which is 2.5 minutes long, I think, and it's for 5-year-olds. And it's basically undermining the notion that children should just do as they're told, and saying, no, you can encourage thinking from even this very early age. So I think that there's no political will. I agree with you. I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think it's an invisibility. I think because all of us know that we're not vulnerable. And if we didn't, we wouldn't be able to trust our perception and interpretation of the world. So when somebody comes along and says,
wait a minute,
what about advertising? You say, well, I know other people are influenced by it, but I've never bought it. And that barrier, I think, is there for everyone to understand that influence is actually not complicated. It's very simple to get somebody to think something, to get to change somebody's mind using various tricks. I mean, I've got into trouble about this, and I'm going to do it again. That I have taken a look at this thing called street epistemology, and I am somewhat concerned. And friends of mine who are, in the business of helping people to think are really promoting these ideas. And I sort of hold back from it and say, but there's a deliberate agenda to change somebody's mind. I don't have that agenda. My agenda is to allow the other person to go away and change their mind if they choose to.
That's the point.
So even the lowest level of persuasion, where you don't declare your agenda, we have a word in English for failing to declare your agenda, and that is manipulation. That's what the word actually means, when you get past that setting about changing somebody's converting them to a different
And I
view.
think people, as they get distance from their group experience, if they're exploring these ideas, allow for a broader perspective, a broader scope on the issue in most cases. Unless, it's a particular perspective, they've committed to it and they're stuck there. But I think there's a lot more to learn about what makes people commit to ideologies above their own need and welfare.
I mean, there's many people say that critical thinking is the missing tool, and I always stand against that, because when I walked into Scientology, I wasn't recruited, and I knew how to make a Socratic argument by that time. I learned that when I was about 14, and my critical thinking, my way of evaluating evidence, was very good. What I didn't know about was these emotional states that give you the sense of certainty, the bliss states. I mean, there's a Buddhist teaching that warns you against the bliss states that are achieved in meditation, but it seems to be lost. Most of the Buddhist schools seem to really favor this idea that you're going to have nirvana in life, rather than going, actually, one of the things that shocked me when I studied transcendental meditation, talked with people about it back in 91, were stories about people spending 12 hours a day meditating, not working anymore, not looking after their children. And I've since read about children pretty much going wild in TM and many other groups, because parents cease to be parents because they're addicted to this. They become meditation junkies.
Yes. Yeah, there is that sub group within the organization that, even though the organization doesn't promote that, they encourage that behavior, they can't help themselves. It's like the drug dealer who says, I'm not, I'm not worried about them becoming addicts. Some people walk away. They do their cocaine and they're not addicted.
It's a personal decision.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I'd like to talk again and talk about your experience with Kevin Garvey and how you became involved in exit counseling, but I feel I've used quite a lot of your time today already.
Well, I thank you, John, for considering me. And I'm not. The first part of the talk was a little scattered, but there's a lot more meat there that I'd like to address and get into, especially the experience of working with various groups and clients, and what led to the development of what we do. And I work with Pat a lot, and how we see different roles within that environment, and bringing in mental health professionals who help guide the family through the difficulties. And for those families willing to go through that process, it seems to be very helpful.
We'll end this conversation. We'll have a little conversation after we stop the recording, if that's okay. I'm John Atack, and it's been a great privilege having Joe Kelly as my guest.
Thank you, John.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.